My name is Paul Grogan. I'd like to welcome all of you here for this very special literary evening. I'm the president of the Boston Foundation, and we were the delighted sponsors and underwriters of this slim but great little volume, The Good City, Writers Explore 21st Century Boston. And we are going to have four. We have three already. We're going to have a fourth shortly of our authors with us this evening to talk or read, really whatever they want to do, to talk about what they wrote in this marvelous collection of 15 essays. A little background about the book. The inspiration for the book was really Mary Jo Meisner, vice president here at the foundation. As we were considering our role in the, if we wanted to play some kind of a role in the fact that the city was hosting for the first time ever a major party political convention this past summer, and it was going to be the time when 30,000 delegates and members of the national and international media were going to be coming to our city. And as we all know, since all the political drama has been expunged from conventions, these people and writers and tourists tend to focus very much on the city that they're visiting. And we were very aware, of course, as we all are, that know something about the city, that many people who are not in Boston or have not been to Boston recently have some very dated, and in some cases not terribly positive, images of this community. And so we thought one of the great ways to mark this occasion and perhaps encourage people to get up to date on the changes that have occurred in this city was to sponsor this this volume. And we never could have done this without the two wonderful editors who carried this project forward. And I don't know what they did to the writers to get them, first of all, to agree to do this for what we were able to pay them, and to do it on the deadlines they were given, because this was all done very, very quickly. But Andy Zellman and Emily Heistand were just absolutely crucial to this project. And I didn't know either of them terribly well before we did this project, and I'm now their devoted admirers. It really incredible. And the other great thing, of course, was that the publisher of the book is Beacon Press, our own homegrown nonprofit press, and they did just an incredible job. So we managed to get this book done on time, and it was distributed along with chocolate-covered cranberries and Gillette razor blades and other things to the 30,000 delegates and members of the media who came. We think this book was the most important and durable thing in the packages. But the book is also available in bookstores all over the country. It has received wonderful reviews consistently. And I think, as a number of the reviewers have said, this book is an important new contribution to the literature of place itself. But in addition to being a remarkable portrait of a dynamic, vital city that has changed a great deal, but still has its challenges and problems. And this was not a Chamber of Commerce Boost Boston kind of volume. You don't go to the kinds of artists that we enlisted in this project and in any way direct what they write. And so they wrote what they wanted to write about their city. But for those of us who have read the book, in my case a number of times, it's a remarkable portrait of a city, of an intriguing city, but one that has also changed a great deal. And it comes together in our fourth writer has arrived. It comes together in some very interesting ways. So without any more from me, I'm going to begin introducing our writers. And the four are Robert Campbell, the Boston Globe architecture critic, sitting to his left, the acclaimed novelist and writing professor Patricia Powell, Scott Kirsner, our technology and innovations guru, and closest to me, Irene Smalls, a delightful children's book author and storyteller. We'd also hoped to be joined by the best-selling author Anita Diamant, who has a wonderful essay in the book, and she apologizes that family matters kept her from being with us tonight, but I think we're going to be very well served, and we're going to have a very full evening with our four. After we hear from each of them, I'm going to pose we're going to have a kind of a conversation about the city and some of the things they've said, and then there'll be a brief opportunity also for those of you in the audience to comment and ask some questions, and I'll moderate that, and then we'll have a reception to close the evening, and the books will be for sale. So for those of you who have not acquired your copy, and the proceeds from the sale of the books go to this is kind of self-interested, but the Boston Foundation Civic Leadership Fund, which supports things like the Good City and the other research and forums and seminars we hold on the city. It's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker this evening, who will be Bob Campbell, who many of you know is a longtime architecture critic for the Boston Globe. It's been my pleasure to know Bob for many, many years. He is both an architect and a writer. He's written more than 80 feature articles in national periodicals. He's a contributing editor to Architectural Record and Preservation, and he is also the co-author with photographer Peter Vanderwarker of a wonderful book called Cityscapes of Boston, An American City Through Time, a copy of which I have on my coffee table. He's been in private practice as an architect since 1975 and is also an urban design consultant to a number of cities, has lectured at colleges and universities, and notably, very notably, in 1996 was the recipient of a Pulitzer Prize for criticism for his role as the architecture critic for the Boston Globe. Please welcome my friend Robert Campbell.
What do you mean, long-time architecture critic of the Globe? It's only been 32 years. I had a fellowship at Columbia last year, and Robert Brustein of the American Repertory Theater also had the same fellowship, and he told me that he had been theater critic of the New Republic since the late 1950s. So I guess I have a little way to go. I haven't prepared any remarks. What I'd like to do is just talk very informally, and I hope we can have some back and forth and some conversation. I do believe that critics should not be promulgators of any particular narrow point of view about the world. There are a lot of ways to do good things, but you do develop a few convictions after writing for 30-some years. And my major conviction, and Paul has just stated it also, it's a definition of architecture. You can define architecture a lot of different ways, and I have a collection of wonderful definitions which I won't tire you out with. But for me, architecture is the art of making places. That, for me, is the best I've ever come up with. It's not an architecture of sculptural buildings that you look at as if they were sculptures. It's not an art like painting. It is an art, but it's the art of making places. And by places, I mean living rooms, corridors, front lawns, golf courses, streets, parks, any humanly made place for human habitation, as far as I'm concerned, is architecture. And that, I think, is how you evaluate it. You can only evaluate architecture by inhabiting it. You can't evaluate it by seeing a picture of it or by standing outside the building and admiring it. You have to inhabit it and experience it as an inhabitant. You don't always have to do that literally. You can do that with your imagination. You can walk down a street in the Back Bay and see the bay windows and imagine yourself back inside that bay window looking out at the street, and you can inhabit things imaginatively. But that's only true if the architecture, as it does in the Back Bay, immediately tells you that there are people inside these volumes. And you can see that by the windows, by the bay windows, by the size of the doors, by the humanly framing kind of elements of the architecture. The piece I wrote for this little book, the only thing I told Andy was that it was going to be short, and it is about density. And I think we're beginning to win that battle. Americans, at least since the time of Thomas Jefferson, which is quite a while ago, have argued that America is a place of great wide open spaces. And people are still moving from San Francisco to Montana to have these sort of endless vistas. I have never lived in a suburb. I've never lived in the country. I like cities. And I think it was Andy who told me I couldn't use this word, one of the two of you, congestion. I love congestion. William White, who did many analyses of what were the popular places in New York, discovered that the place that people were most likely to congregate in New York was the place that was already crowded with other people. And they stayed away from places that were empty. Jane Jacobs, who taught me in her books almost everything I think I know about architecture, makes that same point. And she makes many other interesting points. It's not only a lot of stuff in one place, namely density, but you have to have in one place a variety of different kinds of people, a variety of different levels of rent, so that you can have the cheap storekeeper and the high-priced condo in the same neighborhood, so the condo dweller can take advantage of the newspaper vendor or whatever it may be. Rich people need poor people. Rich people need poor people to mow the lawns and walk the dogs and babysit the babies and millions of other services. And I was shocked to read in the Globe a year or two ago that the last laundromat had left the Back Bay because it couldn't afford the rent. And that sort of thing is happening in the last laundry. That is happening in places like San Francisco, where the prices have risen so high that all of those inexpensive services and the people who operate them are no longer able to live close enough to the rich people to do them any good. And poor people need rich people, too, to call up City Hall and yell about things and, get the streets cleaned and the potholes fixed. And so they're interactive with each other. And you need a level of different rent so that these different things can be active. I think this is a kind of wisdom that really began with Jane Jacobs and her observations in 1962. I guess that first book came out, and has now become. And at that time, it was very much opposed by professional city planners. Has become now the conventional wisdom of city planners everywhere, and we're certainly seeing that beginning to happen in Boston. The problem in Boston, for me, is of course that as more and more people come back into the city and drive prices up higher and higher, it's more and more difficult for lower-income people to remain in the city, and that's a problem that I don't know how to address, but if somebody does, I'd like to know. Just a word about density, and I think I probably mentioned this in my article. Everybody loves Paris, and when you think of Paris, you think of open space. You think of the great boulevards with their trees and the great parks like the Parc Citoyen, which is new, and if you haven't seen it, by all means go, but many other parks. Paris is about the same area as Boston, give or take a few percentage points. And in that area, it has 4.5 times as many people. We think of ourselves as a dense city. We're not at all by European standards, even though we are by American standards. And it's that density that permits there to be 275 metro stops in that same area where we have 40 or 50, that permits there to be shopping, unbroken shopping on every major street, because there are all these people. And I'm not counting the people who work in the city or the tourists, just the people who live there. It's 4.5 times as many as Boston. So I think we have to get over the idea that there's something wrong with crowding together in cities. There are many, many virtues to that. And I think that more and more people are realizing that, and I'm going to be able to stop making this speech after a while. But anyway, I'll just start with that point, and glad to listen to what the other people have to say.
One of my favorite Thomas Jefferson quotes, just to illustrate that though some good flowed from Thomas Jefferson, much ill did as well, as Thomas Jefferson once said, "Cities contain all that is pestilential to the health and morals of mankind." And I think we've been recovering from that idea. Indeed, indeed. The little hypocrisy there, I think. It's now my pleasure to introduce Patricia Powell. We were so delighted when we persuaded her to write an essay on Boston's literary landscape for this collection. She is widely admired for her own explorations of place and identity through her novels and other writing. She's the author of 3 books, Me Dying Trial, A Small Gathering of Bones, and The Pagoda, and a forthcoming 4th novel, which is to be called The Good Life, Following the Good City. Patricia has received many literary honors. Her essay for this book, titled A Literary Landscape from Jamaica to Boston, is the story of her arrival in Boston at age 16 in the heart of a New England winter, which we can certainly empathize with, and her journey of becoming a writer and begin her journey to feeling at home in this, what was a strange new city. Patricia Powell.
Good evening. Well, I thought I'd read a little piece from the essay, and I'll read from the very beginning of it. And was a really interesting moment, the moment at which I was asked to write this essay. I'm not much of an essayist, and so this is sort of my first foray into that world. But I've been living here for 23 years, and I had just a year before writing this essay, I had been invited to take a job in California, and I was all set to move and very excited about leaving after 22 years. And at the last moment, I decided to stay. And I think this essay really allowed me to sort of think through some of the reasons why I ended up staying here. And so that was really good. In a way that one of the wonderful things about the essay is that it is so concise. Compared to the novel, for example, it is so concise, and it forces you to cut right through to the heart of things. In the novel, you can meander quite a bit. So I'll start at the beginning, and I used to think that I became a writer by accident, that a career in economics was where I was headed, until I began failing advanced economics and had to switch to English literature. But I have since come to believe that there are no accidents, that all along I was meant to be a writer, and that my early childhood experiences of separation from my mother, of being raised by my great aunt, who was perpetually on the brink of death, of the mystery surrounding my birth father, and of being united with my mother years later in a foreign country, were not accidents of birth, but were experiences meant to mark me so profoundly they would become the grist that I would spend the next 20 years of my life milling. And I feel, too, that it is no accident that the place where all of this would happen was Boston, the city where I have met, one by one, all the people who would propel me in the direction of a literary life, the city where I would develop all the tools necessary to live out a writer's life. We arrived at Logan Airport in the heart of winter, my brother and sister and I. My mother, who had fled years earlier to Boston from Jamaica to escape her marriage and had settled here, met us at the airport. In batches of 2s and 3s she had sent for her children, and my siblings and I were the last batch. She bundled us up immediately into thick, warm coats, for against that fierce New England cold, our flimsy clothes were like pieces of tissue paper, and hurried us to the car waiting at the curb that would take us to the section of Boston called Dorchester. I was 16, and I had never before been outside Jamaica. I had never seen real snow, and from the back of the slow-moving car, it did not have the clean, white, powdery look I often saw on the postcards my uncle sent from Canada with money. This snow had been piled up on the sides of the road for days and was blackened with dirt and the exhaust from the many cars and trucks that hurtled by. Pieces of garbage clung to the snow, and dogs, it seemed, had found neat little places to defecate. From the front of the car, my mother bombarded us with a steady stream of questions about all the relatives and friends she had left behind. Just a few years behind me in age, Dermot and Jacqueline were happy to see her again, and they filled her in on all the details. But I didn't have answers for any of my mother's questions, and even if I did, my answers were short and blunt. I was not happy to see my mother, for my mother and I were not friends. I did not understand why, of all her children, I was the one she had sent away and never reclaimed until now, and I wanted to know the details of the mystery surrounding my birth father. I didn't know these people. I had never been very friendly with any of my immediate family members, except for an older brother, and yet here I was thrust suddenly into this newly assembled makeshift family after 16 years of estrangement and in this cold, strange place. I was furious, and I was desperately missing my great-aunt Nora, the woman who raised me and who was really my mother, and I was terrified. But this wintry city was to be my home and the place where another phase of my life was beginning, and I felt that my only choice was to settle down into this new existence in this unknown city that was said by everyone to be a place full of opportunities. Our yellow house in Dorchester was located on a residential street lined with close-together houses. a jumble of triple-deckers, Queen Anne's, mansard roof duplexes, stone and brick apartment rows, and even a few Victorians that had known grander days and were crumbling now. There was not a patch of grass to be seen anywhere, just a color of dirt at the mouth of each yard and some scraggly-looking trees, naked without leaves. Kids desperate for a place to shoot hoops and to hang out after school turned an empty lot on the adjacent street into their playground. From our living room windows, we could hear them hooting and shrieking, and we envied them. For unless there was a special request to go to the store or to the post office, we were forbidden to leave the house. My mother foresaw all the many evils that she imagined might promptly befall us on the city's streets, and she threatened all manner of punishments should we disobey her. What else was there to do but to turn inward, to read, to squabble over board games, to watch reruns on television, and to long for my great-aunt's house in Grove Place, the garden full of yellow bells and ostrich plumes, and to dream of the willow trees at the bottom of the veranda where I dozed on so many Sunday afternoons after the big meal. Our part of Dorchester near Grove Hall and on the border of Roxbury was a predominantly working-class and black neighborhood. The Jews and Irish who once lived in this section of town had long since escaped to the suburbs, and before them, the wealthy Bostonians who had made this area their safe, quiet getaway when Dorchester was still a country landscape, a retreat from the city proper. Familiar as they may have looked to me, the American black people of Dorchester were definitely not the same stock as the black people I had grown up around in Jamaica. They did not sing out their greetings the way we did. Their accents had their own strange clipped ring. When they walked, they did not roll their hips in the same fashion. And the spices that we used to season our meats, our thick, rich, hot pepper sauces, were not easy to find here. And when my mother did find them, she complained that they were expensive. Still, they were my people, and if I looked deeply into their faces when they flung their heads back for the laughter to peel out, I could see traces of some of my cousins I had left behind, and that was comforting. The tiny commercial strip not far from my house boasted a barber shop, a hairdressing salon where my mother went to get her straightening, a liquor store, a used furniture store, a ribs and chicken joint that always had a good smell wafting from it, a grocery variety shop that sold everything imaginable, even wigs, and a house of beauty. My mother warned us never to linger in that area, but every evening after school, I made that strip part of my route home, for the sidewalk was always crowded with people laughing and talking, and the streets were always thick with traffic and with loud music blaring from car speakers, and now and again a door would jingle open as I was passing, and I would catch a glimpse of a head frying under an enormous dryer, or a man grinning with a woman and looking at her with eyes that said everything. Thank you.
Wonderful. Next, we're going to hear from Scott Kirsner, who has been a contributing editor for both Fast Company and Wired magazines since 1997. He writes a weekly column for the Boston Globe that we all know called At Large, and his writing has also appeared in a number of other periodicals, including the New York Times, Salon, the London Sunday Telegraph, and the Columbia Journalism Review. His essay, For the Good City, is entitled The Innovation City, in which he explores what is one of the remarkable and very durable facets of this community. Scott Kirsner.
Thanks, Paul. Paul mentioned in his introduction the giveaway bag that all of the delegates got to the convention, and by virtue of the Globe, sponsored one of the opening parties for all the media that came to the convention. That was at the Boston Convention Center, and on the way out of the party, I don't know if you were at this shindig, but they give you the tote bag that all the delegates got, and it's one of those canvas tote bags that everyone has a million of sitting in their closet, with the red straps, and it's full of, as you mentioned, cranberries and Gillette razors, and you forgot to mention that there was a Kraft macaroni and cheese box in which the macaroni was shaped like little donkeys, and so I got the bag home, and it was sitting in my hall, and it was just sort of, I kind of have a small place in Cambridge, and it was crowding the hall. And so I took my copy of The Good City out, because you can never have too many copies of this book. And my sister had suggested to me that we try to sell the bag on eBay. And so she said, take a couple digital pictures, and I took 2 digital pictures of what was in the bag and the bag itself. And during the convention week, we put it on eBay, and the price kept going up and up. You know, as the convention, it was on CNN every day, it was on C-SPAN, and we sold the bag for $84.50, which without the book in it. And the retail price of this is, I don't know, what is it, $14. So I think the only reason that is going to be journalistically defensible is if I write about it at some point. Otherwise, people have said it's very ethically suspect to sell a bag that you got for free at a party. But I don't know, I may try it again. So I want to read just kind of maybe 2 short sections from my essay, and then I also want to sort of do a quick 4-question survey of you all that I think will point up kind of what I see as the 4 main problems that Boston has with regard to science and technology. The essay starts, basically once Andy Zellman asked me to write this essay, I kind of started doing some research about the history of science and technology in Boston. There's very little that's been written about the legacy of invention in the city. But one of the things I stumbled across is that there was a building in downtown Boston, 109 Court Street, where Thomas Edison worked, and Alexander Graham Bell also worked at the same time. And so this was not the building where the telephone was invented, but all of the work leading up to the telephone happened here. And Thomas Edison worked in the same building at the same time, working on, I think, some of his first patented inventions. One was a stock ticker. Another was an automatic vote counter, which is interesting to me because I'm from Florida originally. And so it was interesting that this building was there. I went to look for it to see if it was still standing. There were some pictures that I had seen online, but the building was knocked down. I'm not sure, Bob might know the answer to this, I'm not sure if it happened during the government center, sort of Scully Square.
I did do a Cityscapes piece on it once, but I don't remember when it came down. But that's very likely. Yeah.
And it basically what stood around where the John F. Kennedy Federal Building is now, sort of on the edge of government center. So, it was a great experience to see these pictures of a beautiful building and then go there and see government center. And there's a little plaque that they built that's sort of a pedestal-looking thing that you can find if you go looking for 109 Court Street. So I will read a section or two of the essay. The elements that make up Boston's technology ecosystem are easy enough to enumerate, and they haven't changed much from the time of Edison and Bell. There are world-class universities of Boston that lure students and professors from all over, and then marinate them in corporate and government research dollars. When students graduate and want to start new companies, Boston's sharp-eyed venture capitalists provide funding and guidance and introduce young scientists to experienced executives who can help them manage and nurture their promising startups. There's a core of skillful patent attorneys in town to help innovators protect their ideas. Not least, there are adventurous customers in the Boston metropolis, organizations willing to take a flyer on new technologies. Less easy is outlining how the Boston technology ecosystem can be replicated elsewhere. Foreign countries and other regions of the United States regularly send delegations of economic development officials to Boston to try to understand just what it is about the environment here that creates such fertile conditions for startup companies. Henry Termeer, the chief executive of Genzyme, Massachusetts' largest biotech firm, often meets with visiting dignitaries who want to know how they can cultivate, in their home state or country, the same high concentration of biotech firms that exists in the Kendall Square area of Cambridge, located at the eastern border of the MIT campus. Termeer, who was born in the Netherlands, left a stable job at California-based Baxter International in 1983 to become CEO of the fledgling Genzyme. At that point, the MIT spinoff was just over a year old, and its 11 employees were working with the National Institutes of Health on a therapeutic approach for rare diseases, an approach called enzyme replacement. The company was tiny then, and Termeer and the other employees came to know the first patient to be treated with Genzyme's first product, a 3-year-old boy who was suffering from Gaucher's disease, a serious metabolic disorder. With obvious satisfaction, Termeer reports that patient number 1 is still alive today, married with children. As Genzyme grew, Termeer led the company through an initial public offering, and today he oversees an enterprise that employs more than 5,000 people and has revenues of more than $1 billion a year. One morning I went to see Termier in his penthouse office atop Genzyme's shimmering new headquarters in Kendall Square. The company had only recently moved into the building, which is Boston's first major exemplar of green architecture, a forward-thinking approach to design and construction that places a premium on energy conservation and the use of natural light. The glass-walled building resembled a cubist interpretation of the Emerald City from The Wizard of Oz. On a round table in Termier's office sat a glass vase of pink and yellow tulips. Plenty of cities, Termier reflected, wish they could find a way to foster more innovation and startup activity. But some places are luckier than others. The universities were here, the science was being developed here, and the venture capitalists were here, Termier said, explaining why Boston, along with San Francisco, became one of the country's biotech centers. The explanation for why some regions attract more innovation is as simple as why you don't get tulip bulbs to grow in Russia, Termier continued. The soil is not there. Holland's a tiny country, 16 million people squeezed into a tiny piece of land which is mostly below sea level. And they control the world market for bulbs. You can wish it, but if you don't have the soil, the history, the educational system, and the assumptions people make about the way their careers will go, all you will do is wish. And let me read, do I have a couple more minutes to read a short section here? There's a persistence of innovation here that feels like a geological force, inexorable, by turns constructive and destructive. Boston was a center for telegraphic technology when Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell rented lab space in Boston. That once vibrant industry crumbled, supplanted by the telephone. A century and a half later, Boston's home to companies that are working on enhancements and replacements for the telephone. The microchips that power cell phones, video conferencing systems, speech recognition software that allows you to call an 800 number and plan your next Amtrak trip with a virtual agent. All right, I'm not going to read the very end, but I kind of wanted to do my survey. So the point of the essay is that Boston, since at least the mid-1850s, has been this powerhouse of innovation and has produced not just inventions that we all use every day, but companies that provide jobs for people who live here. But the thing that I didn't focus on much in the essay, but I've been thinking about a lot since then, I wrote a piece for the Globe's Ideas section last year based on the essay. And they kind of asked me to think about what are some of the barriers. You know, why isn't Boston thought of as highly as Silicon Valley is when it comes to high tech? And also, what are some of the challenges here that we face over the next 50 or 100 years? And so I think I've been able to condense those into 4 questions that I want to ask you, and just sort of see by a show of hands how this audience stacks up. I'm curious if, raise your hand if either you own an iPod or you know someone in your family owns an iPod. All right. So raise your hand now if you own an EMC symmetric storage appliance or someone in your family owns an EMC symmetric storage appliance.
What is that?
Okay, good. How about, this is question number 2. You own one. Or she has stock in EMC. Question number 2 is about online education. Have you ever taken a course from University of Phoenix or something online where you've done online learning, or someone in your family has gotten some kind of accreditation online or certification? Raise your hand. So a couple hands. Question number 3 is when you were in high school or college, or when your kids are in high school, raise your hand if biology is one of your favorite subjects or your kids' favorite subjects. More than I thought. And the last question is, raise your hand if you own a house or you own the house or condo in which you live. And keep your hand up if that house or condo is appraised at less than $250,000 right now. So the point that I wanted to make with those 4 questions are those are the 4 challenges that Boston has. Number 1 is about consumer technology versus corporate technology. Boston is really strong at corporate technology. The EMC symmetric, EMC based in Hopkinton is the biggest technology company in the state, but all Massachusetts is really good at is selling corporate technology. We don't have a lot of companies like Apple that sell the iPod that you can go buy at the mall for $250. The EMC symmetric storage appliance is a $25,000 product that only corporate technology people buy. Question number 2 is about online learning, and this is my biggest fear and something that I've been thinking about, which is the main thing that draws people to Boston, draws smart scientists and technologists to Boston, is school. You know, they come here for undergraduate education, they stay for graduate education, they develop some new drug or some new product, and they start a company around it. And my fear is that online learning, there are only a few people who answered the question, yes, they've done some kind of online learning, is that what if you could get a Harvard or MIT education and you didn't have to leave Shanghai or you didn't have to leave Bangalore, India? And MIT has already started kind of the first project, a project called OpenCourseWare, and the idea would be that, you know, you could use the web and probably some combination of video conferencing and online forums to get an MIT education maybe at half the price without actually showing up on campus, or maybe a quarter of the price without showing up on campus. And MIT and Harvard people will tell you, oh, no, that'll never happen. But, you know, 10 years ago, they would have said no one would have ever been getting accredited through University of Phoenix or, you know, Microsoft certification online, and that's happening right now. The third question is biology. I was surprised by the answer here because I don't think, you know, if we look at our school system, is it doing enough to get kids interested in biology, which is clearly the next important skill set that people will need to have if you want to have a job in the 21st century. And part of it, the thing that I fixate on when I talk with people at biotech companies is how often do you go into the schools and show them people who make a living doing science and playing with test tubes and growing cells. And I just think there's that disconnect where you've got lots of people in Kendall Square who make, you know, $100,000 and up a year working in the lab, but they're somehow not getting into the schools to show kids that, hey, this is a viable career path. And the fourth thing is something that I think maybe Bob and Paul both touched on, which is the price of housing issue. And people, when they graduate from college and are looking for that first job, the fact that you could go to North Carolina and get a very nice house for $200,000, $250,000, and you could go to Boston and look for a long time for a $250,000 house and not find anything, is a real problem when it comes to attracting and retaining people in this market. So those are the four questions. Maybe we can talk about those some in the panel discussion if you're interested. But thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Scott. Finally, we're very pleased to welcome to the Foundation this evening Irene Smalls, who is an author, historian, and storyteller. She's had a very interesting life and career. Among other things, she's been, before her writing career, a model, an actress, and a radio reporter. But what she loves most is writing children's books. She's the author of 15 of them, as well as 3 interactive storytelling CDs. Her first book, Irene and the Big Fine Nickel, was inspired by her memories of growing up in Harlem. In another book, Louise's Gift, she tells the story of an unappreciated gift that changes a young girl's view of herself. And 2 of her more recent books celebrate the parent-child relationship. Her particular essay in The Good City is called Boston's Children and the Power of Play. Irene Smalls.
Thank you very much. What I'll do is read from the essay and then basically tease out some questions based on the other panelists and the kinds of things that they've kind of provided as fodder. Dawn Smalls and Jonathan Smalls. It is through my own children and their Lilliputian locomotion that I've come to know Boston as a city of and for children. I grew up in New York in the 1950s in Harlem, New York. And Harlem was a neighborhood. It was, you know, open doors, open hearts. When I tell people that in Harlem, we never locked doors because nobody stole anything. There was no crime. That it was a city where everyone belonged to the children and the children belonged to everyone. And so when I first came to Boston, I was looking for the most New York place I could find. And the most New York place I could find was St. Paul Street, because I identified almost immediately with the brownstones and the streets, and Boston is a walking city. So to have my children grow up in a modern-day version of New York, of my Harlem, was just very, very near and dear to my heart. And I'll read on. And the important thing for me is that in Harlem, play was a part of everyday life. I mean, we played. We went outside, and again, your parents would just kind of go to bed. You'd leave you out in the summertime when it was hot and too hot to stay in the tenements, and we would play. We'd run up and down the street. We'd go, you know, to neighbors' houses and so on and so forth, because that was a sense of neighborhood, a very, very strong sense of place. And in Boston, when I came to St. Paul Street, it was a neighborhood, that there were just a whole gaggle of kids, I'd open the door and put my kids outside and, peek out the window from time to time, and they were playing with everybody. They were fighting with everybody, and they'd be up and down the street, and it was just so glorious. And so in looking at doing a little bit of research to write this essay, the thing that I was most impressed about was how important play was for children, and how play was really sort of the fundamental job of childhood. And in looking at modern architecture and looking at high tech and looking at, the neighborhoods, that I was finding that living in Boston for a number of years, that the amount of play was diminishing. Certainly because of high real estate costs, that it's very nice to have an open space, an open lot where kids can play basketball and, catch and so on and so forth. But when that open lot is worth $2 million, it's more likely to become a high-priced condo or something else. And so when I came to Boston, I remember everybody told me, don't move to St. Paul Street, whatever you do. I had asked a friend who was a real estate broker, and I looked at a house, and I said, what do you think? He said, don't buy it. It's a bad move, bad neighborhood, bad place. But I saw kids. And so that was just, hey, it was a strong, strong recommendation. So I took the risk and bought the house, and my kids grew up on St. Paul Street in the neighborhood. And the thing I enjoyed most about Boston was it being a walking city, which means that I could take my kids and we could, for 0 cents, go to the museum, go to the library, go to, Symphony Hall when they have open houses. There was so much variety and so much richness, which is what I associated with New York City. And so it was an opportunity for my kids to be able to play and to use that power of play to help them grow. Now, from Boston's tiny tot lots to the Fenway Rose Garden to the magnificent green spaces of Olmsted's landscapes, the city of Boston offers its young citizens 273 parks. And added to these formal recreational places are the impromptu play spaces that kids create for themselves. And one of the things that I felt most strongly is that as the years went by and my kids grew up, is that slowly, one by one, family by family, the kids were disappearing. That in my neighborhood now, there are almost no kids. They have a few babies, but there are no children who are about, school age, that the people who live in St. Paul Street, the area now, have children that are infants, and as soon as the children get to school age, they leave. Because the feeling is the schools, Boston Public Schools, are such poor quality that they move to the suburbs for the better schools. And so you have this tremendous gap. You have babies, and then you have young adults, the college students, and there's just about nobody else in between. And if I think of my street now, as I said, because there was a gaggle of kids up and down all the time, that now I think of maybe 3 or 4 kids, and they're all very, very young. And even some of the younger ones go to private daycares, private preschools, and then when they get school age, they move out of the city. And I think that's one of the greatest losses of the city, is because we're losing our children. And children are really what it's all about. That it's very nice to be in high tech and make $100,000 a year, and it's very nice to build buildings and so on and so forth. But the reality is that we are here to live as beings. And children really perpetuate that process, and they really remind us so much of who we are and how we are. And looking at a number of essays in doing the research for this particular piece in the book, there were a number of studies that said children and adults need play. That all work and no play makes Jack a dull and depressed boy. And a lot of the societal ills that we have, the rage and the other kinds of issues, are caused because we're not playing enough. We're not giggling. We're not laughing. And laughter is the best thing in the world you can do for your cardiovascular system. Because everything is huffing and puffing, and the heart's going, and the capillaries are exploding and doing all kinds of, when the blood is circulating and so on and so forth. But how many things in the adult world are really designed to make you laugh? I remember I was walking down the street, and there was a little boy, and there was a puddle, and the street was clear. So he immediately goes and jumps in the puddle. And he had to work to get to that puddle. And I thought, that's fabulous. I think I'm going to go in that puddle. I mean, just for the heck of it. And children remind us that rather than just being in a rush, take a look at that puddle. Look at that splash. Hey, what else is in there? Look at my reflection in that puddle. There is so much beauty that children can provide us that we don't often pay attention to that. And I think that in terms of the health benefits of laughter, the health benefits of children, because children are calming and very soothing, then also the joy at times. I've had my own children, so I remember those long nights too. But it's very, very important that we respect children for who they are and how they are. And also we recognize the child in ourselves. That being a children's author, one of the things that I have to really use a lot is being 7. I think I'm emotionally 7 years old. I haven't grown. I'm absolutely 7 years old. And that's how I can write children's books, because it's not as if I'm remembering, it's because I'm really 7. And so I'm serious. And so the 7-year-old can tell you exactly what happened and exactly how she felt about it. And so it's that authenticity that's so important that children remind us of, who we are and really what's most important about us. I remember once I went for a job interview, and it was a job I was totally unsuited. It was in finance and financial planning, and I really hated math. And so after we go through the interview, and the guy asked me, "What did you do in kindergarten?" And I said, "What?" I brought in my transcript, and I brought in, the kinds of things that I've been involved in. He said, "I don't want to see any of that." And I said, "Well, I just graduated from college. Don't you want to see my grades?" He says, "No, I want to talk about kindergarten." And I was like, okay. Let's talk about kindergarten. And so I answered his questions. And finally, after the interview, and I said, "Well, listen, we both know I'm not suited for this job, so let's just move on. Why did you ask me about kindergarten?" He said, "Because if I ask you about college, you give me a script. If I ask you about kindergarten, I find out who you are." That most people live out their lives in boxes. They start in little tiny boxes when they're in kindergarten, and then the boxes just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they learn how to sometimes camouflage and change the boxes to look nicer on the outside, but the essential box is always there. And so in asking me about kindergarten, I told the truth. I had no concept of making stuff up about kindergarten. And so what I'm saying in terms of fundamental direction for this talk today is that we need to remember who we are as children. We need to remember and understand the impact and the power of play, because it re-energizes and reinforces the essential person that we are. Thank you.
Well, I think we've just heard in these 4 little talks just a wonderful sampling of why this book is so terrific. And we're going to have a little time now to talk with the author some more, and I want to take the privilege of the moderator spot to ask the first question or two. And I would just set it up this way. For those of us who've read the whole book, we know that though the essays do not paper over any of either the city's historical problems or current problems, that overall it's an incredibly positive portrait of Boston today. And Bob Campbell has certainly chronicled this as much as anyone has. There has been a tremendous renaissance of the city. I came here in 1975, and you could really make the argument that Boston was dying, even with all of our universities and students, which is a kind of a buoyance that a lot of cities don't have. And it's just stunning what has occurred. And along with that renaissance, some of the negative realities of the city, its parochialism, its tribalism, its impermeability, the well-chronicled issues with race, if these problems have not disappeared, they have abated very considerably. And in my introductory essay, I say, I left Boston in the mid-'80s for 13 years and came back in 1998, and I was stunned at how much more humane, tolerant, and permeable Boston had become from the very tribal city that I knew. So there is a lot to celebrate here. But a couple of you began to get at what I would call worries about Boston, and I guess I'd like to start with that, is to ask you to tell us what worries you most about the city, or what you think we most need to try to change about Boston to continue and build on the progress that's been made. Anybody want to start with that? Scott, you wanted to elaborate on that?
Yeah, because I have other worries other than the 4 that I mentioned.
You're a worrier.
Well, I mean, I guess it could be sort of, when you go to cities in the South particularly, there's this phenomenal sense of striving and, civic, like we want to prove to you that we're really phenomenal. I mean, Atlanta is the best example of it, but Charlotte and other cities in the South, even Austin, Texas, like there's that real, some would call it boosterism, but it's just this real civic, we'll do anything to impress visitors and to attract businesses. And the two examples that I think about how Boston is not a sort of striving city, whereas the South is striving, we're kind of self-satisfied, I think. The two examples, one is, I don't know if the second is a really good example, but the first one is Wyeth Biopharma is the second biggest biotech employer in Massachusetts, a couple thousand employees. Their big location is up in Andover, right off of I-93. And for about 15 or 20 years, they've been trying to get the state, all they want is one new exit off of I-93. And it's been a 20-year process, and it still hasn't happened. And you talk to economic development officials in other states, and they're like, that's what we fixate on. When companies say we need to build our next facility, where should it be? They fixate on stuff like that it takes you 20 years to get the first shovel in the ground to build a new exit off of 93, whereas today they have these thousands of employees wending through the back streets of Andover to get to work, which isn't good for the neighborhoods there, and it's not good for the employees. And I mentioned it to Tom Finneran, who's the new head of Mass Biotech, and he knows that that's just the landscape of Boston. It'll be interesting to see if he can change that kind of attitude of, companies need to be here because we're so smart, versus let's actually provide them some services. And the other example, which might be a bad one, just really quickly, is when you drive through the tunnels of the Big Dig from day one, before we knew that they were leaking, they just looked awful. It was like, it was all this bathroom tile, and it got dirty really quick. My joke is that, people drive through the Big Dig to see what $14 billion of bathroom tile looks like. And it just was grimy from day one. And I think if that had been a tunnel anywhere in most of the rest of the country, there would have been some focus on, having it look nice the first week it was open, at least. So,
Scott, a lot of people agree with you about this self-satisfied attitude. A good friend of mine, Peter Mead, who's something of a political savant, now an executive at Blue Cross Blue Shield, said the Boston attitude, in contrast to Atlanta and Charlotte and so forth, is if you're not smart enough to understand how great we are, that's your problem. Anybody else want to talk about worries or concerns or what they'd like to change about the city?
I agree with everything, certainly about the tunnels. We talked about, there's a kind of, the natural economic future of a lot of Boston and Cambridge is to become a kind of Georgetown or Beacon Hill of high-priced homes with a lot of locks on the doors and a defensive attitude toward the rest of the world. They're very beautiful, both those neighborhoods, and perhaps some of you live in Beacon Hill, and it's a marvelous place. I don't like that kind of neighborhood. I find I live in Cambridge, and we're moving rapidly in that direction. And I don't know how in a capitalist democracy, it's a really tough problem, you can try to maintain diversity, economic and every other kind of diversity.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of my answers to that would be what you talked about, which is density. I mean, if you could unlock support for much more density in the city, of course, that is one of the big keys to affordability. But we're going to have to build a culture that is much more receptive to, even in crowded Boston, as you note, there's a lot of room for more dense clusters of housing. Mm-hmm. But it also connects, Irene, I think, to your noticing the disappearance of children. I mean, I think housing, the rise in the population of the city has been basically built on people without children. I mean, young people coming in and so-called empty nesters. And the expense, continued worries about the quality of the public schools are another factor that keeps children out of the city. So these are grave concerns. Anybody else want to comment on that?
I mean, it makes me think about an experiment that would be really fun, and the Boston Foundation should take on with the BRA or something, which would be, what if you built a building that had 50 units in it, like 52 bedroom apartments in it, and you said, we're only going to sell these apartments to people who moved to Boston from somewhere outside of Massachusetts. You know what I mean? Like affordable housing program for people that wanted to come to Boston for some reason. They wanted to take a job here. They wanted to live and work here. And what if after you sold all those units, you did a little analysis of who filled up this building? I mean, it would be phenomenal. The people that would come here if you built, just build 50 units of affordable housing. And not that we don't need more affordable housing for people who already live here, but I'm just saying the experiment of seeing who you would attract if Boston had, more of an attitude of let's just put up buildings that people could afford to live in.
But I'm saying there's so many people from Boston, born in Boston, who would love to live in Boston, who can't.
I agree with you.
So the idea of having a building for people from outside seems like, wait a minute,
I'm just saying to do it as an experiment, as a little study to see what kind of people, if we had affordable housing, not only would it make it easier for people that are working for a living, but also, what would it attract? And we don't have this concept that they have in other cities of let's try to attract smart people because we feel like, oh, we already have enough great people who want to live here.
Well, I guess my concern would be when you were talking about biotechnology and the fact that kids are not encouraged to go into those kinds of fields. My concern would be with the people who are here in terms of what kind of cross-pollination, what kind of, really energy is being exerted toward the children and toward the people who are here. That I went to a conference and, the Center for Disease Control was going across the country saying that there's this tremendous opportunity in epidemiology and they don't have enough epidemiologists and so on and so forth. They were saying, we're not getting kids, who are interested in this field because they don't know about it. So I think that there is a job to be done that, biotech is doing well, and I'm glad these companies are doing very well in Andover and so on and so forth. But the question, two questions. One is the level of jobs that are available, the educational opportunities, and also the undergirding of the educational system. So you have a group of people who are capable, able to get to the locations and able to do the job so they can afford to live in the cities. Because what's happened is that for the most part, all of the low-skilled, beginning entry-level jobs have disappeared.
Right.
I've lived in St. Paul Street for a long, long time. And I remember one night, I'm trying to remember, I was going to a neighbor's house for something, had to ask him for something. And it was late, it was like 11 o'clock at night or whatever, but I've been there so long and I know this guy so well that I can go to his house at 11 o'clock. And I was going into the building, and this woman stopped me. She said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Who are you?" And her attitude was, she was almost acting like I was a robber or a thief or something like that. And I was like, wait a minute. And this was this woman who had just moved into the neighborhood, who, didn't know me, didn't know, that I, so on. And I was so offended. And she reacted strictly on the color of my skin. She knew nothing about me. Did not know that I lived across the street, that I've lived across the street for 30 years. But she had just moved in, and she felt very comfortable challenging me about walking down my street. And I remember when I moved in St. Paul Street, the street was 98% African American. There were 2 white families. Now I think there are 2 black families left. And that flip-flop has been caused by a lot of things. And I'm saying, so when you get a house with 50 2-bedroom apartments, there are people who are ready, willing, and able.
I agree 100%.
Okay. So let's build 2. One for the experiment and one for the people who want to live there.
Yeah.
Okay. Then we can do it. Then we can do it.
I just think you need to change that first we need to change the mindset about affordable housing for people that already live here. But 2, let's change the mindset about other cities. Even Providence, being closest to Boston, thinks about what can we do to attract, just to kind of keep that invigorating flow of like new people, new ideas that want to come and live in a place. And we don't have that mindset at all.
I want to comment on that because the difference between Boston and Atlanta and Charlotte and Austin is that Boston's already built. They don't care what they build in Charlotte. I know Charlotte very well. It's a very rich city and a very interesting city, and they don't give a damn what they build as long as it's going to attract people. And you get a very ugly environment typically out of that. We did that here in the 1960s, and everybody is still reacting against that. I mean, Boston had been economically dead for 2 generations, and in the 60s they said, we're going to get this place moving again, and we don't care what we have to do. If we have to demolish neighborhoods, we'll do it. We did all that, and we're reacting against that, And now there is a very powerful citizens lobby in Boston and Cambridge and other in Brooklyn and so on. That are opposed to anything new coming in because they feel so traumatized by what came in at different times in the past. And the problem then is what is the right balance? Take the medical area, the Longwood medical area. It is an absolutely powerful economic engine that Boston desperately needs. It is also a threat to every residential neighborhood around it because it's pushing up prices. It is one great big traffic jam. then how do you balance that? How do you say, how can we still have growth and not have the kind of growth that's that in a city that's already built isn't going to be destructive in some way? It's not an easy question.
It isn't, but I would tend to put the affordability of housing as a way to bring new people into the city and make it affordable for people that are already here to live here above aesthetics every time. I mean, I would rather have not great building built where someone could actually afford to buy a $150,000 condo, close to a T-stop, which pretty much doesn't exist today. You might rank them differently. I don't know.
I don't see why we can't have both.
It would be great to have both.
A bright spot on housing, and then I want to open it up and ask you to participate and direct some questions at our panelists. We did get a major housing bill passed last year in the Commonwealth, 40R, and the regulations. It hasn't really had any effect yet because it's just rolling out, but it's the Smart Growth Housing Act, it's called, and it provides a new set of state incentives for Boston and every other city in town in Massachusetts to rezone land around transit stops on surplus commercial land and in town centers for housing with certain density and affordability requirements. And there's a lot of interest in this. And Scott, the reason this issue got traction, admittedly belatedly, finally, was the connection was made between both holding on to talent that's growing up here and attracting talent we need from elsewhere, that this was really we are losing people that we used to keep. Students who used to come here now go home or go somewhere else because they can't afford a place, and our own children exit as well. So it's making these kinds of connections that we hope will lead to enlightened policy where you can have both beautifully designed housing but that is denser, which will increase the vitality in all these towns, the urbanity of them, but also begin to solve this problem. Okay, I'd like to open it up to all of you for a few more minutes before we have our reception. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask, a comment they'd like to make, briefly? Yes, could you introduce yourself, please?
Melanie Walensky, and I'm just moved here in
Could you take the microphone?
Oh, sure.
Okay. Yeah.
Melody Walensky. I just moved from Northampton, Massachusetts in September. And I'm a member of the creative class, so to speak. I'm a writer. And I was drawn to Boston as a writer, but also for educational reasons for my children. My question has to do with if you overcome the obstacles of affordable housing to retain, not so much to attract people from outside the area or outside the state, if you overcome some of the obstacles to retaining that young generation just out of college, looking, in their first job, looking to buy some real estate and settle down, let's say they have their parents' help in getting that first home, then, what are some of the other factors that, or some of the other obstacles that can be overcome in retaining the people, the younger people, that so-called innovation generation who are leaving Boston for cheaper places and milder climates and so forth?
Can you schools?
Anybody want to respond to that? What else do we need to do to attract those young people, either the ones that grew up here to stay or people from other places?
I mean, we could try to change the weather. It seems like, we're on that track in a macro way with the global warming thing, but,
I think it'd be really important to improve the quality of the Boston public schools. I think if Boston had a reputation as having stellar schools, quality education, Boston Latin across the system, that we would be able to retain and attract a lot more people. And I think that the upside of that is that the talent pool will be expanded so vastly that the biotechs and the new kinds of technologies coming out of MIT and Harvard will have, a tremendous group of people who can take advantage of that.
Right.
I was just going to say, one of the models that's really interesting to me is there's a charter school that a friend of mine started called the Media and Technology Charter School that's on ComApp. And they're doing some really interesting things with I'm not saying you have to do it in charter schools and not public schools, but they're doing some interesting things in terms of getting people from industry to come in and, getting working journalists to come in and teach the kids who are in the newspaper or working technology people. And I think Boston could be kind of a laboratory for some kind of new, a morphing of the educational system where it was less about learning for learning's sake and more had that connection to, exploring things that you might want to do when you grow up and kind of having that interplay between people who actually make a living doing math or doing biology to make you understand, here's why I need to learn trigonometry. And we could go on about this a little bit, but one of the problems I think right now is that a lot of, you talk to your typical high school student and the only models that they see are sort of actors, athletes, musicians, people that, it's not reasonable that every kid in Boston Public Schools today is going to grow up to be, to play for the Red Sox or to have a major label recording contract. So.
It's interesting. We actually have some data on this in answer to your question. The Boston Foundation and the Chamber of Commerce last year sponsored what I think is the first ever comprehensive survey of Boston college and university students and recent graduates about their attitudes toward settling in the region. And housing, as it is here tonight, looms very large, but it's not the only thing. There are some other factors. One of them is that as lively as Boston has become, it shuts down much too early for young people, in contrast to New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, some of the cities that we're competing with. And the transit system stops at 1 o'clock, which is very distressing. Related to that, the cost of owning and maintaining an automobile in the Boston area came out very strongly in the survey as a deterrent to staying. And so there's some other factors here. But another thing is what the kids see as the opacity of the job market, the lack of connection they have to economic opportunity, and it has led the. Speaking of technology, it has led the chamber, among other things, to really spur the business community to do a lot more outreach to students while they're here, because they just don't know how to get into the opportunities that are here. So I think the good news is that leadership in the community is at least beginning to focus, and you got to talk to people to find out, and we're talking more. I noted the mayor in a big speech recently noted that a third of the people in the city today are between the ages of 25 and 40. It's an astonishing demographic opportunity that we have that's fleeting unless we capture it. And he got a very loud message that for middle class and upper middle class folks that have high expectations of an education system, the Boston Public Schools don't cut it. And they've got to address the issue of educational quality beyond the exam high schools, which we know are very good. So I think that's very positive if we're going to identify these factors as crucial to the city's future, to begin working together on some things that can be done about it. We have a little more time. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Dawn Kramer. I live in Rosendale, which is actually an amazingly diverse, interesting part of Boston, which has the potential to do the kinds of things that you would like to see happen that may not become St. Botolph Street. But I'm talking about fun. I have a friend who teaches kindergarten who is, in fact, on a mental health leave of absence because she cannot bear the fact that she cannot get out there and dance with her kindergarten kids because they've got to read, they've got to write, they've got to do all this stuff now, and there's MCAS tests. So fun is the basis of learning. Fun and imagination and the arts and dancing and music and thinking scientifically, imaginatively, that's where we get kids hooked. So how do we deal with that in our system? How can we bring back fun and imagination and not get so obsessed with, percentiles and stuff?
If I could speak to that for a moment, because the science clearly says that children need to be physically active, they need to be engaged, so on and so forth. We don't teach based on science. We teach based on, I don't know whose ideas. And the whole idea of testing young children is just, the worst thing in the world you can do. They're supposed to be scribbling. They shouldn't be made to sit still and write in nice little lines and so on and so forth. That's not the nature of childhood. The nature of childhood is exploratory, and the creative aspects are all kind of encouraged by this open-ended kind of play. And what we've done in our educational system is begun to test the future out of them. And so they get turned off, and we wonder what's happening and why.
Yes. Sir, go ahead. Okay. Well, chivalry is not dead. Very good.
Hi, my name's Emily Jung, and I'm here from ICIC with a couple of my colleagues here.
You might say what ICIC is. Not everyone knows.
ICIC, Paul, you're pretty familiar with it. Paul sits on our board. ICIC stands for the Initiative for a Competitive Inner City. We are an urban economic development firm that Michael Porter founded, who is a HBS professor. And we actually deal with economic development on a daily basis. The team that we come from, we are consultants to urban cities and dealing or working with the workforce issues and those items that are quite prominent. One of the questions that I did have for you all, we've talked about the past and being here for 20 and 30 years as residents. You've seen what's been going on, coming off of a year, Boston winning the world champion, the Red Sox, to the DNC. Where do you see maybe the next 5 or 10 years or even 20 years of Boston going without saying that these are what it needs to change, but really as its natural trajectory? Where do you see that going? Thanks.
Great question.
Well, in terms of my neighborhood, St. Paul Street, I see it becoming a Nantucket, where you have all of these high-priced homes that are largely vacant because the people have several homes and they use it just as a place to, stay when they're in the city. And there'll be no children. There'll be absolutely no children. They just built a new park, Titus Sparrow Park, which was named after an African-American tennis player, professional tennis player. And they spent like $1 million redoing the park. And the South End, which is 2 blocks away where it starts, has a sizable number of subsidized buildings, Meth Union Manor, etc. And they specifically asked for play areas that would be appropriate because they had children that were 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old. When they redid Titus Sparrow Park, they redid it only for the little children, for the St. Paul Street residents. And 2 blocks away, there's this whole gaggle of kids who would love to come to the park and really fully utilize the park. What they did was they gave them a basketball court. That was the one concession. And I thought that was such a travesty, to spend $1 million to redo a park to fit only one demographic group. And you have the opportunity to have a park that would serve the whole neighborhood. So I really see the neighborhood, at least from my perspective, as becoming like Nantucket, or the rich, or the near rich.
Scott, how do you see the city 5, 10, 20?
I'm glad you mentioned sports, because I feel like now that we have, the Red Sox as World Series champions and the Patriots potentially, 3 Super Bowl victories in 4 years, I feel like maybe we could leave the sports thing alone for a while. There's a professor over at MIT named Woody Flowers who used to host the show Scientific American Frontiers on PBS, and he's one of the just most interesting, well-respected professors at MIT. And he was incensed when they named the new tunnel under the harbor after Ted Williams, because he said, here we have one of the great feats of engineering of our time, and we name it after, and these are Woody's words, a guy who could hit a rock with a stick. And his point was an interesting one, which is that, Boston really loves to celebrate sports heroes, and you don't have us celebrating great technologists, great engineers, great innovators. There was a guy who grew up in Chelsea, Lewis Latimer, who was probably one of the most important African-American inventors of American history. In the 1800s, I sort of have a joke in my essay that, Edison invented the light bulb, but Lewis Latimer invented the threaded light bulb socket, which paved the way for the development of the light bulb joke. And, we don't celebrate people like that. I'm surprised you know who Lewis Latimer is. I don't know if anyone else in the room did. And I guess I would love for Boston to sort of maybe shift its focus into not just scientific and technical innovation, but innovation in these other areas like education, like affordable housing, kind of to set some, do some experiments and set some standards for the country, rather than kind of rest on our sports laurels for the next 5 years or whatever your time frame was.
I can't resist a brief answer of my own. At least an aspect of how the city is going to do, I think, will relate to the immense development that's going to occur in the city and how that gets done, whether it's true to the values that Bob Campbell thinks or hopes are ascendant in terms of the true urban values. If you think about the land over the Big Dig, the waterfront, which is an enormous question, and the fact that the harbor was cleaned is a huge opportunity for the city, and there's a lot of value being created there. Harvard's intention to build an enormous second campus in Alston across the river. How these things unfold, I think, will say a great deal about the kind of city that we're going to have. I think we have time for one more. You, sir, in the back.
James Goldstein's my name. I have two quick questions, both deriving from, I was at a conference this morning about the Metro Future planning process that the Boston Foundation is one of the funders of, which is a regional planning effort looking at the 101 communities, including Boston, in the region, and looking out 30 years. It raises a number of issues, including density. And the exercise at this meeting today was to have each of the hundreds of participants indicate with dots on maps where new residents ought to be, and what would be densified or what new land would be developed, and so forth. And it struck me in this exercise, and I think other people as well, that almost all of the new growth, and this is consistent with, I think, kind of new urbanist principles and so forth, was along transit and was in already developed areas, which is all to the well and good. But it was also almost exclusively in low-income areas. It wasn't the Back Bay. It wasn't Lincoln. It was in lower-income areas. And the question I have is, how do you encourage density yet maintain character of neighborhoods like the Back Bay and so forth? And how does one balance that so all of the new development, new growth, is not in lower income areas? And okay.
It's very important not to confuse density with overwhelming scale. The Back Bay today has the same density as downtown Houston, which is an area of super high office buildings, but also a lot of parking lots and a lot of super highways. And when you average it out, Back Bay is just as dense. I don't see that as an issue. I accept the new urbanist principles that you put development where the transit is, but then that means you might want to build some new transit too, such as the urban ring and other things. In answer to this question, I had a couple of quick points. One thing that's going to change is a lot of people are going to be living downtown. That is the policy of the city, and there's not the office market downtown that there used to be, and that is something that will certainly happen. And a second thing that's happening in Boston and many other cities is that universities and other institutions, but especially universities, are becoming the city planners, the de facto city planners. The city planning agencies were developed in the 1960s to practice. Federal money was pouring out of Washington into cities, and a class of city planners sort of developed in order to spend that money. That money's not coming anymore, and the city planning agency in Boston is largely reactive, not proactive now, trying to spin public benefits out of private development. And then we're seeing in many, many cities, the universities beginning to become the major city planners, Harvard, MIT, but also many others that I could name.
Well, I know it's a tease to have so many intriguing issues raised and have so many more questions to ask, but I think we should have our further conversations with glasses in our hands. And so I invite you now to the reception. But first, will you join me in thanking our four splendid authors?